Hello everyone, and welcome back for episode 2 of Bauerhausen Presents Album of the Year. Today we jump back in where we left off in 1989. The first album I want to look back on today is the debut studio album of De La Soul, 3 Feet High and Rising. Released on February 6th, 1989 by Tommy Boy Records. This album is almost exactly 36 years old today, which is pretty wild to me. 3 Feet High and Rising was produced by Paul Edward Houston, better known by his stage name Prince Paul. As far as I can tell, Prince Paul is best known for his production on this album, but it's not where his legacy begins or ends. Paul was an innovator, and he changed the landscape of hip-hop with his innovation in sampling and mixing styles. A lot of this can be seen on this album. The production here is like a sonic scrapbook. Imagine a collage that mixes snippets of classic rock, bubblegum pop, obscure soul tracks, and even samples from like TV shows and movies. That's what it is. This cut and paste method of sampling was revolutionary at the time, and it did a lot to add to the charm of this album in particular. This album is often categorized as alternative hip hop, because it broke away from the dominant gangster rap themes of the time, sounding completely different from other popular albums of artists like Ice-T, NWA, and Ghetto Boys, who were big in the rap scene at the time. This album instead favored witty, humorous, and socially observant lyrics. It is also considered seminal work in the Native Tongues movement. If you don't know about the Native Tongues movement, in short, it helped reshape hip-hop music by challenging the norms of the time, fostering a sense of community and cultural pride, and pushing the boundaries of musical creativity. I don't want to get too deep into it because that's not the subject of this podcast. But if you have any interest in the history of hip-hop music or just musical history in general, I think it's worth looking into the Native Tongues movement. It's a really interesting topic to read into, watch some videos about. 3 Feet High and Rising is often cited as one of the greatest hip-hop albums of all time. It makes tons of lists. You can find it on the list everywhere on the internet that you look. Its fluent influence on the hip-hop world is undeniable. Artists such as Outkast, Kanye West, Queen Latifah, A Tribe Called Quest, and the Jungle Brothers, just to name a few, have all said that this album in particular was a major influence on their own music. It's often seen as a blueprint for later experimental and alternative approaches to hip-hop and rap music in general. I think a lot of that is really obvious if you listen to this album, you still listen to hip-hop music, or you have listened to hip-hop music from the point this was released in 1989 through the 90s, through the 2000s. And the way this album used samples literally changed the way that the industry cleared samples for use in music as a whole. There's no way to downplay the relevance of this album in the history of music. As far as my favorite songs on the album, I know the song, and it's kind of a cliche, but I love Me, Myself, and I. The instrumental for that song alone is so iconic and so nostalgic for me. I vividly remember hearing it featured in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and Beavis and Butt-Head, and just hearing it a ton when I was a kid growing up. In closing, 3 Feet High and Rising isn't just an album. It's a cultural milestone that reshaped hip-hop's creative landscape and the world of music and sampling in general. And I know that's a heavy statement, but it really, really is true. That being said, my personal score for this album may seem a little bit low for some. I give 3 Feet High and Rising by De La Soul a 7.4 out of 10. And my reasons behind that potentially low score are that the album, for me personally, had a lot of filler. What I considered filler, anyway. Keep in mind that I'm looking at this album through the lens of 2025. As hard as I try to put myself in 1989, it's difficult knowing what I know about hip-hop now and having heard all that I've heard throughout the years. I also find the album to get a little too silly for me at times. I know that's part of the point. I get that. But yeah, just a little bit too silly for me sometimes. All of that being said, I take nothing away from this album. If you'd give it a perfect 10, I'd never argue that. I see it. I get it. Music is subjective, and that's one of my favorite things that I love so much about it. So I just say let's all enjoy music the way that we do and let others do the same. Now, let's move on to an album that I didn't listen to much growing up, but I've gained massive respect for and admiration for as a teenager and a young adult, and still into my 30s. We're talking about Pretty Hate Machine by Nine Inch Nails. Released on, let's see, why don't I have the date here? Released on October 20th, 1989 by TVT Records. Pretty Hate Machine is the debut album by industrial rockers Nine Inch Nails. Now, I say industrial rockers, but Nine Inch Nails at this point is essentially just Trent Reznor, who wrote, performed, and produced nearly every element of this album at his in-home studio set up in his apartment in Cleveland. This album is so good and so far ahead of its time, but knowing it was a one-man project made it in an apartment studio really adds to the lore and respect of the music for me. It's incredible work. In musical styles and themes, this album is quite possibly the most influential album to industrial music history. It's the blueprint for how that harsh industrial rock sound can perfectly blend with easily digestible electronic elements and like catchy, danceable rhythms that help to make it a commercial success. Lyrically, Pretty Hate Machine deals with personal and emotional turmoil, often touching on themes of anger, isolation, self-loathing, and alienation. Themes that would make me really, really appreciate this album as a teen, in my more intense early emo days. And as an adult, I really appreciate the undercurrent of, the critique towards consumerism and social norms. This album has a lot for the angsty folks out there. As for favorite songs, man, that's a tough one with this album. There are so many great songs. Head Like a Hole, Terrible Lie, and Down in It might be one of the best 3-song openings of any album ever. Honestly, it's probably a 3-way tie for me between those 3 songs as to which is my favorite. As I said, speaking about 3 Feet High and Rising, I don't like to choose the most popular song because it's usually not the best one in most contemporary albums, in most albums in general. But with this album, I think Head Like a Hole is the clear choice. Just, picking the most popular song 2 in a row, it's not like me, but here we are. As for my personal score, I give Pretty Hate Machine by Nine Inch Nails a solid 8 out of 10. What holds it back from being a 9 or even a perfect 10 for me is that some of the lyrics are a little too emo and cringe for me. I don't know. I think I've grown out of that aforementioned early emo stage of my life. I think as a teenager, I was a little more receptive to the cringy lyrics. My final thoughts on this album: Pretty Hate Machine is much more than just a debut album. It's a seminal work. It not only launched Nine Inch Nails, but also played a key role in shaping the sound and attitude of industrial music. Its blend of electronic experimentation, rock, and emotionally charged lyrics, and like I said, the catchy, hooky, sometimes even pop vibes that you get from this album. It's really important to music culture, whether it's appreciated for its production, innovation, its raw emotional honesty, its influence on future artists. The album remains a touchstone in alternative music history. I don't think enough good can be said about this, and it's got a great cover too. I know I haven't talked too much about album art so far, but it's something that I really enjoy. Okay, next we're going to take a look at another album that I didn't listen to much growing up, or at all growing up, to be honest. We're going to talk about Bleach by Nirvana. Of course, I'm familiar with other Nirvana albums. We'll get into Nevermind and In Utero in much later episodes of this podcast, once we get into the early 90s. But the only song from Bleach that I really knew was About a Girl, and that's more from hearing it, listening over and over to Nirvana's 1994 album, MTV Unplugged in New York, which is a great album. So I was excited to see what I'd been missing all these years. Let's start with a little information about Bleach before I get into my opinions, though. So, recorded in December of 1988 at Reciprocal Records in Seattle, Washington. Bleach is Nirvana's debut album. It was released on June 15th, 1989 through Seattle-based independent record label Sub Pop, which, if you're a music fan, you probably know about Sub Pop. They're fucking iconic. Produced by Jack Endino, I think is how you say his last name, not 100% sure. Producer well known for his work with several other bands in the grunge scene. The recording sessions were done on a relatively low budget and within a short time frame, which adds a lot to the raw and unpolished sound of Bleach. At the time of recording, the band's lineup was not as it would be for the rest of their later work in the 90s. So Kurt Cobain was, of course, on lead vocals and guitar the whole time. Chris Novoselic on bass, but their drummer for this album was a man named Chad Channing. In the spring of 1990, Chad would leave Nirvana, citing creative differences and frustrations with lack of involvement in songwriting. In the fall of 1990, Cobain would see their future drummer, Dave Grohl, play with his band at the time, Scream, and he would hire him to be the drummer for Nirvana. Grohl would remain with the band until its unfortunate end in 1994. The album's sound was influenced by the local Seattle scene, with bands such as Melvins, Mudhoney, and Sonic Youth playing a role in shaping its style, which is, some great influence, if you ask me. We're going to have plenty of Melvins on this little project of mine. So the melding of punk's simplicity with heavier, sludgier riffs would come to define the grunge movement. The heavy, distorted guitar riffs, the gritty, unrefined production, and the melodic undertones heard on this album would become staples that can be heard through the grunge music scene in the early 90s and beyond. This album and band ended up being extremely influential in their own right. Upon release, Bleach was not commercially successful. It remained an underground success with the Indian punk scene in Seattle until the 1991 release and massive success of Nirvana's next album, Nevermind. Then fans would, they got curious about the band's earlier works, found Bleach, and spread it to a wider audience and much more broad success. As for favorite songs, it's hard to say. I think a little more time is needed with this album to really decide. As I said earlier, I know and I love the song About a Girl. But that's not because of this album specifically. I do think the album is bookended really well by the songs Blue as the first song and the song Downer as the last song. I think if you've never heard this album and you're curious if you might like it, those are two good songs to check out just to kind of get a feel for it. About a Girl is by far the poppiest song on that album. A lot of the other stuff is very raw. It's a pretty different sound. Now for my score, considering everything I know about the album and knowing a rough idea of what my scores for Nevermind and In Utero will be in coming years, I have to give Bleach a little bit of a lower score. So for me, Bleach by Nirvana is going to get a 7.7 out of 10. Bleach is a vital piece of rock history. It both captures the gritty spirit of the late 80s and simultaneously it sets the stage for what's to come in grunge music as a whole. And in the early 90s, grunge is still around. Like, you can still find grunge bands now, and they are still influenced by Nirvana. If you're a fan of Nirvana's more well-known stuff like I am, and have never gone back to check this out, I would say do it. It was a fun listen, and it was exactly the kind of thing that I started this podcast for. So for our final album that we're going to look at this episode, I will be taking a look at an album I had never heard anything from, and a band I had never heard of, to be completely honest. I'm talking about the self-titled debut album by the Stone Roses. The Stone Roses formed in Manchester in the mid-1980s and quickly developed a reputation for their distinctive sound, a fusion of 1960s psychedelia, rock and roll, jangle pop, and an emerging dance and acid house influence. So before the album's release, the band had generated buzz with a handful of singles and energetic live performances, setting the stage for their debut. Released on May 2nd, 1989 by Silvertone, a division of Zomba Records, this album was widely celebrated for its role in shaping the British indie scene, with its influential blend of rock, psychedelia, and dance rhythms. Producer John Leckie was the perfect man for the job, in my opinion, to preserve and enhance the signature sound that this band had, as he had previously worked with bands like the Beatles and Pink Floyd, other very, at times, trippy and psychedelic rock bands. The album's emergence coincided with the rise of the Manchester scene, a cultural and musical movement centered around Manchester that blended alternative rock with the dance and club culture of the time. The Stone Roses is often cited as the blueprint for that scene, influencing countless bands in the early 1990s. For favorite songs, this is another one that I feel like I need more time with. I'd say the ones that stuck out to me the most on my initial listen were She Bangs the Drums, Waterfall, and specifically Shoot You Down I liked quite a bit. The Stone Roses album is more than just a collection of songs. It's a snapshot of a transformative time in British music. By fusing psychedelic rock, indie sensibilities, and dance rhythms, the Stone Roses created a sound that was both an homage to the past and a bold statement for the future. Its influence can be heard in countless bands that followed, and its status as a classic debut remains unchallenged. Whether you're drawn in by the hypnotic grooves, the catchy anthems, the cultural significance, the album continues to captivate listeners and inspire new artists around the world. So for me, this album gets a 7.5 out of 10, and that score may grow on repeat listens. I have a feeling that the catchiness of this album will hook me more on the next go around and on subsequent listens after that. And that will do it for episode 2. As I said at the end of episode 1, I don't use social media anymore, so there won't be any kind of social media for this podcast. Excuse me. So the best way to get a hold of me, if you really want to, is to leave comments on Spotify, on YouTube. I can be found on Discord. I'm on there under the name Bauerhausen. This podcast can be found on Spotify or YouTube for now. But I do want to mention something that I completely forgot in the last episode. If you're into professional wrestling, you can check out my other podcast where my friend Eric and I are going through old Pro Wrestling Guerrilla Battle of Los Angeles events and reviewing them. That podcast is called Nattering BOLA, BOLA, and can be found by searching for Nattering E or Visionaries Global Media wherever you get your podcasts. Even if you're not into wrestling, I still encourage you to check out Eric's wide array of podcasts on Nattering With E. The dude is a podcast machine. He has so many great episodes. He covers sports, comics, movies, music, anything pop culture you can think of, entertainment, wrestling. Like I said, guy's a podcast machine. One last shout out before I go. I want to give a huge thank you to the website albumoftheyear.org. I'm not only using that website to compile a playlist of albums for this podcast, but that's the first website that I visit every Friday morning to see what new albums have come out. They have one of the best, most comprehensive lists of music, new and old, that I've ever seen. Like that website is completely invaluable to me as someone who loves music as much as I do. And that's all I have for episode 2. So I hope you're enjoying listening to the podcast. And yeah, I mean, if you're listening, please leave me a comment. Let me know how you're liking it. Find me on Discord. I'm open to suggestions for albums I should listen to, not only for 1989, but for the coming years. Yeah, that's it. Everybody have a great day.